in the pre-dawn darkness of a typical medieval village, there were no alarm clocks, just an overconfident rooster with a punctuality disorder and an uncanny ability to crow precisely when no one wanted him to. The day began not with the swipe of a touchscreen snooze button, but with the hollow thunk of wooden clogs on dirt floors and the comforting smell of, well, let's be honest, smoke, damp wool, and maybe a faint trace of cabbage. Work shaped everything, not in a follow your dreams Pinterest quote kind of way, but in the way porridge shapes a peasant's stomach, blandly, persistently, and often with a little too much effort. In most societies before clocks ticked on walls and espresso machines hissed kindly at us, the concept of a day job was less about titles and more about avoiding famine. The average peasant's workday was governed by the sun, the seasons, and the whims of whichever noble currently claimed dominion over your particular patch of mud. You rose when the sun hinted at returning, before the dew had the courtesy to dry, and trudged off to your task du jour, ploughing, threshing, chopping wood, or one of the other chores that sound quaint in period dramas, but mostly just hurt your back and gave you calluses in places you didn't know could grow calluses. And yet, amid the many blisters and beetroot stews, there was rhythm. A day of work was a seasonal symphony, a graceful, albeit muddy waltz, with harvest festivals marking crescendos and winters providing unwanted pauses. Let's consider the communal oven. In many towns, particularly throughout medieval Europe, there wasn't a personal baking setup in every home. No sourdough starters passed down through generations of Instagram bakers here. Instead, entire neighborhoods would bring their loaves to one central oven. There wasn't an official bake-off, but you better believe that when Agnes's rye loaf came out with that perfect golden crust, the village noticed. Flour, you see, was currency. Firewood, even more so. And gossip, well, that fueled everything. Over in ancient Egypt, the Nile brought more than crocodiles and inspiration for tattoos. It brought work. The silt left behind after seasonal flooding was a gift from the god Hapi, and people responded in kind, by farming like their lives depended on it. Because they did. The Fertile Crescent wasn't tending itself after all. Bread and beer, those twin pillars of Egyptian cuisine, didn't just materialize. Someone had to grind the grain, mix the wort, toss in whatever qualified as yeast back then, and hope no angry deity was in a bad mood that harvest. Even pharaohs, for all their linen elegance, didn't eat unless the bakers and brewers woke up before dawn. It's sobering to think that the supposed incarnations of gods walked on the labor of people who sleepily muttered, "Just 5 more minutes," before getting up to pound flour with stone tools. Yes, your boss may schedule early meetings, but at least they don't require kneeling in sandmills before sunrise. Fast forward to the Roman Empire, because who doesn't love a bit of togas and contradiction? Their work ethic was both impressive and suspiciously flexible. Roman citizens prided themselves on discipline and structure, but they also had more vacation days than a modern startup promising work-life balance. Yet, the roads didn't pave themselves. Mile after mile of stone and sweat connected their world together, laid by soldiers, slaves, and the unsung contractors of the ancient world. Probably with the same complaints about rain delays and over-budget projects. Markets opened at first light, not because of demand analytics, but because chickens don't wait. Bakers, potters, metalworkers, and fishmongers all displayed their handiwork in stalls that doubled as stages for human theatre. Someone was always haggling too loudly. A child was always darting under tables, and some donkey was always doing what donkeys do in the worst possible place. When we pull the curtain back on ancient work life, we don't just find toil, we find community stitched into calloused hands. Labor wasn't isolated, it was always shared. You might be responsible for mending nets while your neighbor spun wool, and someone's uncle tried, poorly, to shoe a horse. But it all came together, like a communal meal with too much barley and just enough laughter to make it worthwhile. So yes, the porridge was plentiful, the hours long, and the backs bent. But even then, rhythms of life carried their own sleepy song, one that hummed through sunrises and crackling hearths, stories murmured over spindles and scythes. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Go ahead, rest now. The looms can wait. In the misty folds of early morning, when roosters served as alarm clocks and snooze buttons were just dreams you hadn't woken from yet. Life began with the shuffle of feet on dirt floors. Let us wander into the daily toil of an ancient world, where time wasn't kept in minutes, but in muscle aches and the position of the sun. Now, picture a Roman farmer standing in the dim light of dawn, probably named something like Gaius or Marcus or Caesar, if his parents had high hopes. He doesn't stretch glamorously into his day like in a modern yoga commercial. No, Gaius is already chewing on something that might generously be called bread, dried to the point it could double as both nourishment and self-defense. Tools in hand, he steps outside to his small plot of land, which he fervently believes belongs to him, though the local magistrate and 27 different tax collectors would politely disagree. This modest farm, a few olive trees, some stubborn grapevines, and a goat with the attitude of a fallen senator, requires constant attention. There was no weekend in this world, just a rolling rhythm of labor, sunburns, and the occasional festival that devolved into competitive wine drinking and goat polo. These seemingly endless workdays weren't just about growing food. They were about survival, yes, but also status and stability. The Roman ideal of virtues, the masculine virtue of hard work, discipline, and oh yes, conquering Gaul when time allowed, was deeply tied to labor. To toil the land was not just rustic necessity, it was also noble, assuming, of course, one wasn't enslaved. Ah yes, slavery, an all too common feature of ancient labor systems. Roman society leaned heavily on the backs of those denied even the illusion of freedom. These individuals did everything from mining silver out of Spanish hills to tutoring the awkward teenage children of wealthy households who, historically, preferred to feast and fret about poetry than learn it. The enslaved were the invisible oil in the creaky gears of empire, and their work shaped not only the economy, but the very foundation of what Rome considered civilized. Meanwhile, in the cool corridors of Egypt, while the Nile swished softly by like the world's laziest calendar, labor took on a rhythm of its own. Egyptian farmers prayed not for productivity software but for a good flood, a delightful irony given that their entire economy depended on a well-behaved river having an occasional over-enthusiastic outburst. When the Nile ensured fertile soil, planting and harvesting kept thousands busy, elbow deep in mud and hope. Work there was often tied to grander projects. For example, when taxes, or let's call them strongly suggested donations to Pharaoh's glory fund, didn't roll in as grain, one might find themselves volunteering thousands of hours stacking stones for pyramids. And let's clear up the myth while we're here. Despite Hollywood's impressive dedication to miseducation, The pyramids were not built with alien technology or by enslaved masses whipped to dust. Most scholars now agree that a large number were skilled laborers, well-fed, moderately paid, and possibly unionized before unions were even cool. Elsewhere, in the woven tapestries of ancient China, daily work buzzed along the veins of canals and rice paddies, where farmers bent over mirror-still water, planting rice with the precision of calligraphers. Labor was family-bound, generational, and bound to the changing whims of the ruler, the weather, and a rather poetic understanding of bureaucracy. The imperial exam system, which tested whether one could quote Confucius while possibly starving, wasn't just about getting a nice desk job. It was a dream of climbing out of grueling labor and into a life of bureaucracy, which, to be fair, can be its own kind of toil. Whether it was the clash of metal in a blacksmith's forge, or the soft, persistent weave of cloth on a loom in a Hellenistic workshop, ancient work was rarely glamorous, but it was essential. It built cities, fed armies, and made possible all the philosophical musing and marble sculpting we tend to romanticize from the comfort of our adjustable beds. And so, as the ancient world continued to spin on its dusty axis, daily work was less about punching clocks and more about shaping civilizations, grain by grain, stone by stone, thought by thought. Let's not wander too far in our sandals just yet. There is more to uncover, more tools, more trades, and more curious little secrets hidden behind the clamor of ancient labor. But for now, let us rest our imaginations and let tomorrow's work gently lull us forward. The day began, as most did in the medieval countryside, with a rooster shrieking its best impression of a trumpet and a farmer quietly wishing that roosters understood weekends. Long before city folk brewed their morning coffee, or even remembered their own names, villagers were already ankle-deep in mud, dreams replaced by tasks. And oh, did society revolve around tasks? Daily work was not just a necessity. It was the glue, the rhythm, the sleepy metronome of life. Imagine you're waking up in a little English village around the 12th century. You're lying on a straw mattress that pokes you with all the joyful subtlety of a hedgehog engaged in interpretive dance. Your home is a timber-framed hut with wattle and daub walls and a thatched roof holding on to structural integrity with little more than a hope and cobwebs. Smoke from the hearth flirts with the low ceiling, giving everything a rustic, smoky ambience. Mediterranean restaurants would charge extra for it nowadays. You stretch, if you dare. Avoid hitting your head on the beams above. Daily work is already whirling outside your door. A neighbor passes by, balancing a basket of eggs on her head, with the poise of a yoga master balancing life and credit card bills. Her child trails behind, tasked with shepherding 3 reluctant geese across a path that the geese clearly believe belongs to them. Now, before romanticizing this daily hustle into some Pinterest-worthy pastoral charm, let's be clear, this was hard work. Back-breakingly, sun-up to sundown hard. But for all its grit and grime, it shaped everything. How people ate, how they believed, even how they loved. To work was to exist. In medieval Europe, your job was more than your job. It was your identity. If your name was John Smith, odds were good you were smelting metal and definitely not coordinating HR strategy. Bakers baked, millers milled, thatchers, well, they thatched. Your surname was less a family name than a job description that stuck like flour to dough. But interestingly, daily work created its own little economies within communities. Let's take the humble alewife. Brewing beer was not only common labor, it was essential. Water wasn't exactly sipping quality, and beer provided a safer, mildly happier alternative. Alewives, often women, brewed batches right in their homes. Boring history secret, you ask? These backyard brewers were key players in the local economy and among the earliest female entrepreneurs in Europe. Their signs would often feature a bush or ivy hanging above the door known as an ale stake, to alert thirsty passers-by that a fresh brew was ready. No glowing neon necessary. Work also created time, well, sort of. Time before mechanical clocks was measured by more poetic standards, like when the light hit little Timmy's left shoelace at precisely the angle that meant it was time to milk the goat, or when the church bell rang out from the hilltop for morning prayers, also meaning breakfast, which, depending on the village, ranged from a hearty porridge to, surprise, you only get yesterday's stale turnips. And for all the praise lavished upon knights and kings, society functioned because of the repeating rhythms of the everyday, the plough pulled through wet fields, the loom creaking in the corner of a firelit cottage, the blacksmith's hammer setting the heartbeat of the town. But daily work wasn't always dreary. There were moments of gossip and wit, of song and stories passed between labourers. Work created pockets of community. A stonemason passing on a trick to his apprentice, or a washerwoman sharing the juiciest village scandal while smacking linens on a river rock. And of course, there were feast days, a kind of medieval 3-day weekend, though with more turnips and fewer backyard grills. Still, a different kind of table awaited those who worked higher in society. Not all daily labour required calloused hands. In manor houses and monasteries, scribes stitched language into parchment, stewards tallied grain stores, and monks brewed beer so carefully you'd be tempted to classify them as both faithful and fabulously tipsy. From sun-starched farms to the shadowy corners of candle-lit scriptoria, work-stitched together medieval life like an old quilt, coarse but warm, familiar and necessary. As dusk begins to press its gentle weight on the village, you hear distant sheep bleating goodnight from the hills. Tools are set aside. Embers sigh softly in cooking hearths. Another day of work ends not with a bang, but with the hush of shared sleep and slow, wood-scented dreams. And in the quiet that follows, we drift to another corner of old life, where not all work made sweat, and some toils left ink instead of dirt. The sun was already peeking over the misty ridgeline when the villagers of a 14th century hamlet shuffled out of their timber-framed cottages, yawning into their woolen sleeves. Work, you see, waited for no one, not even the feudal lords with their fourth mug of morning mead. While modern mornings might greet us with espresso and existential dread, the medieval peasant had somewhat simpler wake-up calls, like a rooster with boundary issues, or a neighbour already hammering, something suspiciously important. Daily work in the Middle Ages wasn't bustling corner offices or inboxes filled with requests from Bob in accounting. No, thank goodness. It was mud, manure, and the theological question of whether digging a ditch was a form of prayer by proxy, because in many cases it kind of was. The Catholic Church taught that labour was a means of spiritual discipline, which meant that hoeing turnips could be considered a sacrifice unto the Lord. Presumably, this gave the humble field hand a reason not to scream when he reaped 7 potatoes after 9 hours. But that wasn't the full picture. Work in medieval society reflected not just economy, but identity. A cobbler wasn't merely someone who fixed shoes. He was cobbling God's earthly order back into soulful harmony. A blacksmith, a sacred fire breather who could bend iron like sin itself. And the baker, the baker was basically an alchemist blessed by yeast and rumour, trusted to feed the village and not forget the salt this time. Much of the year's rhythm was dictated not by strategy meetings or shipping schedules, but the slow spin of the agricultural calendar. The ploughing, planting, growing, and harvesting seasons shaped not just the work, but time itself. Forget wristwatches. Just look at the state of your neighbor's cabbages. Springtime was for hope, summer for sweat, autumn for grateful muttering, and winter was for knitting, complaining, and occasionally remembering what sunlight looked like. In England, villagers divided their to-do lists, mostly unwritten and mostly mud-stained, according to something called open field farming, which sounds rather liberating until you realize it meant everyone shared 3 giant fields and rotated them out every year, whether they liked it or not. A bit like if your office shared 1 open laptop and took turns typing for 3 seasons, then buried it for the 4th out of tradition. Now, while the peasants bent over their furrows and reasoned with stubborn sheep, the townsfolk had their own brand of busyness. Artisans' guilds lined the narrow lanes with shops full of half-finished projects and fully formed opinions. There were candle makers debating wick thickness, weavers weaving existential metaphors, and coopers making barrels for ale, water, and occasionally their own stifled screams during festival season. Within the guilds, work meant not just craft, but rank and ritual. Apprentices would start at age 12 or so, after deciding they weren't cut out for Latin or ploughshares. These kids swept floors, stirred vats, and absorbed ancient knowledge like how to tell birch from beech, and when to hide from the master's wife. After several devoted blisters and all years, a worthy apprentice might become a journeyman, so named because he could wander to other towns plying his trade and his increasingly dramatic backstory. And should that journeyman create a masterpiece, literally a masterpiece, impressing their elders and not setting anything on fire in the process, he might finally become a master of his craft. A noble ambition, unless of course your trade was dung collector, in which case the title might feel slightly undermined by the smell. Outside the towns and fields, monasteries offered their own working rhythm, as monks toggled between prayer, gardening, brewing, and transcribing books with a level of cursive that remains prettier than any modern email signature. Work here was spiritual and silent, unless Brother Elfric knocked over the ink again, in which case there might have been a discreet sigh, or perhaps even a stern "oh dear." Whether smudging manuscripts, milking goats, or chiseling cathedrals, medieval work was more than toil. It was tapestry, weaving people into the social, spiritual, and seasonal threads of their time. Every task, however modest, fit into a shared belief that life, rather than being convenient, was deeply meaningful in its dirt-smudged repetition. And of course, not everything was hardship and half-cooked porridge. There were village festivals, market days, maypole dances performed with mild confusion, and moments of rest by crackling fires where stories were told about ghosts, saints, wandering knights, and that one time Edric fell in the well while trying to impress the miller's daughter. As dusk touches the edge of the past like smoke curling through lattice windows, we leave the villagers to their rest and turn gently toward another path, not of fields and firewood this time, but of those whose labor came not with dirt under the fingernails, but with ink on the fingertips and parchment on the brain. The soft glow of candlelight flickers along the uneven stone walls of a medieval bakery, casting a doughy sort of shadow play while the baker yawns into the early hours. Somewhere in 13th century France, a man with flour in every crevice of his being is kneading dough with the kind of intensity usually reserved for sculptors or new parents. And in a way, both are not terribly dissimilar occupations, demanding sleepless nights, devotion, and a constant belief that something good will eventually rise. Daily work in old societies was not simply a matter of employment. It was the heartbeat of survival and the rhythm of civilization. When the rooster crowed, or whatever local sound functioned as nature's over-enthusiastic alarm clock, people awoke not for passion projects or coffee-fueled brainstorming sessions, but to sheer necessity. No grain ground, no bread, no flax spun, no tunic, no blacksmith hammering away, no plough to plough with. The world was held together less by kings and castles, and more by people elbow deep in things: milk, soil, sheep. Let's sip tea for a moment and wander through ancient Rome. Now, the Romans loved a good title. Senators, tribunes, emperors with names that could double as password reset questions. But the real muscle of the city lay in the calloused hands of the plebeians. These were your cobblers, butchers, lamplighters, and laundresses. Although the Roman undergarments left little to the imagination, rest assured they were very well laundered. The fullers, essentially ancient dry cleaners, used a mixture of clay, water, and, well, let's politely call it urine-based ammonia. Yes, Romans washed clothes in wee, a daily job not so much dignified as pungently dedicated. If the toga was gleaming, you had a fuller to thank, and perhaps to avoid at dinner parties. Over in the East, in the symphonic cadence of Japanese feudal society, there were similarly meticulous roles. The rice farmer's day was orchestrated with painstaking routine. Rain meant joy. Drought meant long conversations with Shinto gods, politely asking them to reconsider the weather patterns. Every action, from the precise flick of a scythe to the hand-tied bundles of paddy stalks, was like choreography from a particularly muddy ballet. Ancient Egypt saw its own kind of agricultural ballet, directed by the annual swell of the Nile. Farmers worshipped the river with pragmatic reverence, not the poetic "O mighty Nile" sort, but more the "please don't flood too much this year" brand of affection. Their most humbling job: pulling water manually from canals to irrigate fields. These workers invented devices like the shaduf, a long pole with a bucket and counterweight that turned muscle soreness into a patriotic duty. Too often we hear of ancient rulers erecting monuments, unleashing wars, or posing heroically in stone. But it was work, the monotonous, daily, dirt under the fingernails kind of work, that truly shaped societies. Monument building required masons. Masons needed hammers. Hammers needed forging. And forging required someone somewhere awake at a positively indecent hour, making flame and steel kiss until something useful appeared. In small villages across northern Europe, the occupation of the cooper, yes, that's the humble barrel maker, was as critical as any knight with a broadsword. Without barrels, there was no way to store ale. And without ale, arguably no reason to be medieval at all. Imagine a time when a wooden circle of staves and hoops determined your water security, your pickled winter supply, and your general mood. Let's not forget shepherds, condemned to endless days and starry vigils with sheep, who were somehow both the loneliest and most serenely philosophical employees of the ancient world. Watching clouds roll while simultaneously preventing your woolly charges from launching themselves off cliffs is an unusual resume line. But someone had to do it. And do it they did, whittling flutes, humming to the sky, composing existential thoughts about mutton. There was, hidden quietly beneath the noise of history, an orchestration of ordinary people simply showing up for the day, woken not by purpose podcast episodes but by tradition, obligation, and occasionally goats walking across their faces. And though their names are lost, their impact is carved into every stone, woven into every fabric, baked into daily bread that once filled the air with steam and hope. As the stars twinkle gently above an Assyrian roof, and a woman grinds barley under an oil lamp, let's slip into that next whisper of labor, a kind of daily work that may not have dirtied the hands, but certainly bent the mind. For when quill met scroll, and Clark squinted by candlelight, whole civilizations began to remember themselves. Let us now drift gently to the banks of the Nile, sometime around 1350 BCE, where the sun toasted the earth just enough to remind the people of Egypt that Ra was always watching. This was a world where time moved with the flow of water and the rhythm of work, steady, methodical, and surprisingly bureaucratic for an ancient civilization obsessed with cats, death, and ordering things into very symmetrical tombs. Here, daily labor wasn't just a necessity, it was a rhythm, a votive act, a hymn to harmony. Even the Grand Pyramids were built not by miserable slaves groaning through the dust, as popular myth would have it, but largely by well-fed laborers on royal payrolls. Think ancient construction crews who were paid in bread, beer, onions, and occasional state-issued loincloths. Not a bad gig, really. Especially the part about the beer. It was thick, frothy, and contained enough nutrients to function as a meal replacement option sponsored by Osiris. Work in Egypt had a way of being sacred and mundane at once. If you were a scribe, you were part of the elite, a purveyor of knowledge, a wizard of ink, a master of the papyrus scroll. And yet, you were still expected to record grain deliveries, track corvée labor quotas, and occasionally help calculate how many cows ate too much royal barley. A curious blend of clerical excitement and well-regulated mathematics in the service of divine order. Nothing like falling asleep counting cows in demotic script. Farmers along the Nile, meanwhile, had their labor scheduled directly by the river itself. The days poured forward with the seasonal flooding, called the inundation when you're feeling fancy, bringing rich silt to the farmlands without requiring a single spreadsheet. Every year it came, just as planned, flooding the land, depositing its gift of black earth, and triggering a cascade of work, ploughing, planting, more ploughing, and more planting. What started as a cosmic calendar became a social one. To wake up in Egypt was to wake up inside a very dusty, very warm schedule. Their dedication to structure extended everywhere. Bakers, brewers, potters, sandal makers, and embalmers. Yes, even the people who spent their working hours stuffing linen into nostrils in preparation for eternity. All followed labor practices woven into the very fabric of religion. You didn't just make sandals for fun. You made sandals because sandal-less feet in the afterlife sounded like a pharaonic HR complaint waiting to happen. A particularly important job title belongs to the merit. These were women employed as singers, dancers, musicians, ritual workers really, who served in temples and on ceremonial barges as contributors to holy noise. Not your everyday office band. Their labor had both beauty and bureaucracy, and they remind us that in Egypt, work was not always drudgery. Sometimes it meant singing joyfully while someone else sacrificed a goat in the background. Depending on the goat, one might even call that a Good Tuesday. And then there's one of my personal favorites, the tomb builders of Deir el-Medina, an entire village of skilled laborers employed full-time to design, construct, and decorate the elaborate burial homes for the pharaohs of the New Kingdom. These artisans worked to the sound of chisels in stone and gossip in the air. We even have their ancient complaint letters on record. One of them reads, and I'm paraphrasing here, "I can't paint glorious funerary scenes if I'm short on beer and my sandals are falling apart." A sentiment as timeless as the art it protested for. What's quietly tender is how work in Egypt threaded itself into eternity. You'd be buried with tools of your trade, perhaps a carving knife if you were a sculptor, or a model granary if you were a farmer, just in case the afterlife didn't come with universal farming subsidies. And of course, the Book of the Dead required a detailed resume. If you failed to demonstrate sufficient professional cleanliness or honesty, your heart might be devoured by a terrifying part lion, part hippo, part alligator hybrid named Amit, which is quite the cosmic HR department. But let your eyes grow heavier now, because beyond the dunes and the whispered chants of workers smoothing alabaster walls, there lies another realm of labor, just as peculiar, just as precise, awaiting in the misty hills of ancient China, where farmers spoke to dragons and emperors kept calendars like sacred scrolls of work schedules. In the softly clattering rhythm of medieval Europe, there were no 8-hour shifts, no coffee breaks, and certainly no ergonomic chairs. Yet the people toiled from can't see in the morning to can't see at night, fueled not by cappuccinos, but by oat porridge, stubbornness, and whatever motivation one draws from a stern priest threatening eternal damnation for poor work ethic. Now, among medieval labourers, few had it more theatrically grueling than the cooper. That, dear sleeper, is not a professional chicken coaxer, but rather a barrel maker. Yes, barrels, those cylindrical vessels of every dreamer's fermented beverage and pickled cabbage cargo. The cooper's existence was a saga of oddly satisfying geometry, smoke-scented aprons, and wooden staves that somehow miraculously fitted together like a 3D puzzle dreamed up by a medieval wizard. The daily work of a cooper had zero rainforest ambience and maximum wrist action. Saws screeched, hammers thumped, and fire occasionally crackled as the wood was heated to bend into shape. If boots could sigh in exhaustion, the coopers would have whimpered nightly. Meanwhile, just a few paces across the muddy town square, the blacksmith was busy performing daily miracles with nothing more than incredibly hot metal sticks. The forge was where iron ore became tools, horseshoes, and suspiciously pointy pokers. Blacksmiths were equal parts alchemist and neighborhood therapist. 1 second, they'd be reforging a plowshare for old man Mickelson, and the next, quietly listening to Lady Agnes rage about her third husband's unusual fondness for mead and goats. The blacksmith's hours were dictated by daylight and the sheer number of angry villagers waiting in queue with broken shovels and bent swords. It was dusty, it was sweaty, and no one in history has ever wanted to hug a blacksmith after a long shift. Yet for all their elemental bluster, these craftspeople anchored more than just the economy. They shaped the tempo of society. In the village, time flowed not by clocks, but by tasks. You knew it was mid-morning when the baker's chimney stopped smoking. You knew it was nearly supper when the cooper began whistling tunelessly while sanding down a lid. And you knew it was too late when you heard the scream of the miller discovering rats in the grain bin. Again. Now, among the cobbled streets and thatched roof routines, there was another figure with an equally curious rhythm to their grind. The scribe. Ah yes, the romantic life of writing for a living. Nothing screams action and adventure quite like copying Gregorian chants with a goose feather for 12 hours straight. In the candle-lit corners of monasteries, cloistered away from the mud and manure of the broader world, scribes wrote. They inked. They illuminated margins with absurdly cheery snails and very concerned-looking lions because apparently medieval monks loved both spiritual devotion and borderline psychedelic marginalia. Their day began with prayer, continued with parchment scraping, and often ended in quiet contemplation, partly of the divine and partly of how much their fingers cramped. Still, these calm, cloistered scribes preserved entire civilizations of knowledge, one illuminated page at a time, with only the occasional ink smudge-induced tantrum recorded in the margins beside the Virgin Mary. While these specialists carried out their daily rituals, the bulk of society, namely peasants, did the kind of work that modern gym-goers pay monthly for: carrying hay, digging ditches, herding sheep who had absolutely no respect for personal boundaries or geographic lines. The life of a peasant was defined by the seasons, and each day's work was just one thread in a larger tapestry woven from frost, flood, and the occasional runaway pig. And of course, in the noble class, daily work was a controversial term. The lords and ladies considered falcon training and banquet planning to be arduous labours. A particularly strenuous Tuesday might involve confiscating land, engaging in courtly flirtation, and trying not to stumble into a minor war over inheritance issues. You know, the classics. So much of historical labour was deeply physical, intensely repetitive, and yet oddly delicate in rhythm. A scythe swings best at a certain pace. A quill writes truest when unhurried. A fishmonger must sing to the eels just so, lest they take offence and wriggle off in protest. Probably. Daily work shaped societies not just in outcomes, but in structure. It dictated class roles, gender expectations, and where you stood in line for cheese. Whether whispering vows in a scriptorium or hammering out tools in a village forge, people met each sunrise with purpose, even if that purpose was just keep making shoes until someone wakes the rooster. And as the medieval village slowly spins into its candlelit slumber, perhaps we ought to pull back our historical curtain and peer gently into a different kind of work, the deliciously odd world of noble servitude, and who, exactly, had to carry all those embroidery pillows from castle to castle. The sun rises slowly over a dusty medieval town, yawning like a baker after a night of kneading loaves. Somewhere nearby, a rooster forgets how to crow, coughs awkwardly, then tries again. It's a new day in the loosely organized chaos of a pre-industrial world, where the workday starts whenever the cows look judgmental enough. Now, before you admire modern ergonomic office chairs or the mild thrill of a functioning copier, consider the working environment of a 13th century cobbler. No podcasts, no lunch breaks, and footwear options best described as aspirationally shoe-like. The cobbler, seated on a modest stool with questionable lumbar support, would thread leather with a needle thicker than your pinky and gossip with passing neighbours about wool prices, and how Brother Ethelstan saw a frog that looked just like the king. Work, in these earlier centuries, didn't come in neat chunks of 9 to 5. It came wrapped in seasons, wrapped in prayer bells, and sometimes wrapped in damp fog that made you question everything, including whether you'd left the goats too close to the barley again. Take the humble ploughman, the backbone of the medieval economy and eternal wearer of mud. Early paintings depict him stooped, sun-kissed, and by sun-kissed we mean overcooked, guiding a heavy wooden plough drawn by oxen, too philosophical for their own good. These beasts of burden spent most of the morning contemplating whether mud tasted better at sunrise. Ploughing was not just a job, It was a legacy, passed down like awkward surnames or suspiciously specific superstitions. And while it might seem monotonous, there was an unexpected choreography to it all. The ploughman guided the team, avoiding the tree stump from last year's incident, waving politely at the neighbouring peasant, also attempting to grow slightly less mouldy turnips this time around. Meanwhile, up the hill, in a slightly fancier hat, lived the blacksmith, the medieval hype man for all things metal. His days were long, loud, and occasionally spark-filled enough to make you flinch in your sleep. Villagers came to him not just for horseshoes and nails, but for dreams shaped from iron, spoons, candle holders, and once, for reasons no one would explain, a perfectly forged duck. The blacksmith was both revered and mildly feared. Something about controlling fire with a hammer gave him a mythos. Children claimed he melted the stars. He encouraged the rumour. But working life wasn't all manual labour and mysterious forge ducks. Clerks, scribes, and monks spent their days hunched under candlelight, copying manuscripts with the intensity of someone trying not to smudge ink with their elbow, patient, painstaking, and profoundly underpaid. These scribes preserved not just religious texts, but wild stories, random weather notes, and once a cat's paw print that wandered across a page in the 15th century and stayed there forever, turning that feline into an accidental author of ecclesiastical history. Workplace distractions, of course, are eternal. In the medieval world, distractions included wandering minstrels trying out new material, sudden pig-related emergencies, and outbreaks of something described only as feeling ghostish. A monk might start a hymn, pause mid-note, and claim divine confusion. A carpenter might stop halfway through a chair and decide it was instead a very shallow bookshelf for a particularly tiny library. Yet for all the unpredictability, daily work gave structure to wildly unstructured lives. In a world without email or microwave popcorn, the rhythm of tasks anchored people. You milked the goat, you swept the hearth, you told the same joke about the bishop and the cabbage merchant until someone finally admitted it was funny. Even in the chilly halls of medieval castles, work rippled into grand chambers. Chamberlains managed schedules with eyebrow twitches. Servants bustled with more baskets than sense. And somewhere, always, someone was polishing a sword that no one had used or cleaned properly since the last time someone accidentally jousted a fruit cart. Work wore many faces: weary, soot-covered, parchment-smudged, or just quietly proud. And though it changed across centuries and regions, its deeper gift remained the same: connection. To land, to community, and to a life shared through effort, sweat, and the occasional goose-related scandal. So let our minds now float gently forward, past quills and team-ploughing oxen, into another curious corner of history, where leisure and labour start to blur, and festivals bloom from the work-worn ground. It's late evening in the ancient Roman Empire, and the olive oil lamp flickers softly in a villa tucked somewhere near the Tiber. Outside, a mule brays indignantly at its workload, possibly drafting a union proposal by moonlight. But inside, in the heart of this comfortable domus, we find a Roman paterfamilias reclining. Not just because lying down to eat was apparently the fashionable thing to do, but also because he was heroically tired. The Romans, as it turns out, were pioneers of work-life balance, sort of. They didn't have weekends per se, but they had feast days, usually in honor of some god or another. That meant no work today, Jupiter demands it. With over 150 religious festivals folding neatly into the calendar, many Romans began to suspect the gods really didn't like productivity. But when the Romans did work, oh, they made it count. The daily grind in the empire could range from intellectually exhausting to physically tormenting. For the patricians, those cushioned elites, work might mean reading Cicero or organizing estate accounts with a level of concern that suggests working in the same way modern executives strategize while golfing. The average plebeian, however, wasn't lolling about on cushions. He or she was rising before dawn, clanging out of bed to avoid the punitive Roman sun, and heading toward trades, stalls, or the building sites where half of Rome seemed to be constantly under construction. A problem only worsened by Caesar's love for grand-scale makeovers. Artisans filled their shops with the rhythmic clinks and chisels of ancient productivity. Bakers rose at criminally early hours to start their ovens, offering freshly baked bread as both food and, at times, edible currency. And let's spare a moment of sleepy admiration for the tanners, those brave souls working with animal hides and chemicals that smelled like betrayal and old shoes. Perhaps the most overlooked of all Roman workers, though, were the scribes, the clerks and scribes who copied official records with infinite patience and probably more caffeine than any toga could conceal. They ensured endless scrolls of taxation and census data remained legible, neatly rolled, and astonishingly tedious. Work in the Roman world was not driven so much by efficiency as by tradition. Time wasn't micromanaged by the ticks of a clock, but by the sun's lazy arc and the priestly declarations of auspicious hours. Midday, when the heat turned the forum into a pan-roasted amphitheatre, marked the sacred pause of the meridiatum. Yes, that's Latin for nap time. Imagine an entire empire authorized to snooze. Civilization indeed. And then there was the curious case of Roman plumbing. We must address it, if only because someone had to do the plumbing work, a job requiring bravery as well as a limited sense of smell. Aqueducts, those gracefully arching constructions, kept urban centers hydrated and smug. The men who maintained these watery veins were the unsung heroes of hygiene, though their job titles, sadly, were less elegant than the architecture they serviced. While Roman society tied one's social status neatly to the kind of labor one performed, manual labor, yes, in lower class, thinking about labor, bashi upper class, there were always exceptions. Farming, for instance, was considered a noble endeavor, even for aristocrats, as long as you weren't the one doing the hoeing. Owning land was both business and prestige, and the Roman landowner would often brag about his estates while lacking the ability to sow an actual seed, unless it was metaphorical during a philosophical debate. Slaves, too, formed an undeniable foundation of Roman labor. They ran households, taught children, trained gladiators, and, when gifted particularly good fortune, earned their freedom. Romans were oddly proud of this system, claiming it was a path to integration, a creative spin, much like calling unpaid overtime a growth opportunity. Yet despite all this, bustle and hierarchy, the Roman sense of civic duty infused their work lives with an air of purpose, even if that purpose sometimes involved drunken banquets and trying not to be poisoned. To build an empire required both stone and sweat, logic and legions, and no shortage of people willing to get up at dawn, squint into the Mediterranean sky, and mutter, "Another day, another denarius." As the Roman laborer shutters his stall, curling into an ancient version of a hammock, possibly a bear pelt tied to strategically placed pegs, let's tip our sleep hats to a civilization that made working hard look disturbingly organized. But tomorrow, across a very different landscape of tasks and toil, another rhythm begins to hum softly in the fields and forests of medieval Europe. In the hushed half-light of early dawn, long before the birds bothered to compose their first chirp, medieval bakers were already up to their elbows in dough, sweating slightly beside cavernous ovens that glowed like miniature suns. It was a world where alarm clocks were still centuries away, and time was kept not by digital digits, but by the groan of hinge-heavy shutters and the flicker of oil lamps reluctantly snuffed out. The medieval bread-maker's day began when most of us would still be dreaming of avoiding Mondays. Their work was essential, not only in terms of breakfast, but also for society's literal survival. Bread was the bedrock of the European diet for centuries. Lightly charred if you were poor, stuffed with saffron and illusions if you were rich. But this wasn't just any bread. We're talking about the kind of bread that could double as a blunt weapon if improperly prepared. Glossy brown loaves, unevenly baked thanks to the unpredictable temperament of wood-fired ovens. There were no timers, no precision thermometers, just gut instinct, years of sour experience, and the occasional singed eyebrow. Smelling burned crusts and muttering ancient curses in Latin was, shall we say, part of the ambience. And while you might think, ah yes, the artisan baker, living their best yeasty life, medieval bakers were tightly regulated by guilds, laws, and what one might generously describe as an early form of gluten governance. In 13th century England, the Assize of Bread and Ale laid down laws so detailed they could put modern recipe blogs to shame. For instance, you might be fined or publicly shamed if your loaves were underweight, or if your buns contained treacherous amounts of sawdust. Yes, that happened. Sawdust. Apparently, it was fibre, but dangerously splintery. The town ale taster or bread inspector, a real sworn-in job mind you, would make surprise visits, poking loaves as if they expected to find secrets hiding inside. If suspiciously small or suspiciously heavy, the baker might endure punishment, from hefty fees to the ghastly pillory, a very public, very splintery time out. Still, bakers weren't the only early risers in history's working world. Let's drift gently across the sands to ancient Mesopotamia, where scribes busily etched cuneiform script onto clay tablets before the sun dared to climb the sky. These scribes weren't just glorified note-takers, no. They were the human spreadsheets of the Bronze Age. They documented everything from grain rations to goat thefts, with painstaking neatness and the patience of 10 saints. Learning to write in cuneiform wasn't for the faint of wrist. Young scribes in training started young in what was known as the Ediba, the tablet house. Picture a school run entirely on the principle that repetition breeds skill, but also wrist cramp. They repeated phrases like, "A proper scribe does not speak in the classroom," in wet clay, until they got it right, or cried quietly into their styluses. But to be fair, a scribe had status, especially in a society where literacy wasn't widespread. They were information gatekeepers, and everyone needed them, from kings to goat herders. A goat dispute wasn't just shouted over a fence. It was written down, archived, argued, and perhaps relitigated years later by someone with a very long beard and an unusually fond relationship with bureaucracy. It wasn't always goat drama. The ancient scribes also kept intricate records of workers, which were fairly detailed and remarkably similar to modern times. Wages, shifts, assigned duties. Did one worker disappear mysteriously before finishing the ziggurat ramp? There's probably a clay tablet about that, something to the tune of "Worker Marduk did not show up," possibly eaten by lion or joined rival city-state. Recommend withholding barley. Even in ancient machinations, work was not just survival. It was ceremony, routine, and identity. People were defined by what they did, often literally labeled by their trade. Think of names like John Smith or Baker or Cooper. That's barrel maker, not celestial space cowboy. Your profession stuck to you like ancient sap, passed from parent to child, tucked into family crests, and sometimes, terrifyingly, tattooed into social class. As the midday heat swelled in Mesopotamia, and the scent of fresh bread cooled over English cobbles far to the west, work continued, quietly proud, rhythmically repetitive, and occasionally interrupted by divine omens or the plague. But let us now saunter sleepily to a more pastoral place. Imagine fields stretching wide under sleepy skies, where scythes gleam in golden sun and shepherds hum to sheep who frankly do not care. Work goes on there too, quiet as a dream. Let's go look. In the still hush of pre-industrial towns, before morning's first yawn crept through wooden shutters, the world of work was already whispering itself into action, not with alarm clocks or the tormenting trill of smartphone notifications, but with the soft clatter of a market cart or the rhythmic creak of a windlass turning in a village well. The people of the past may not have had calendars filled with meetings or digital reminders to hydrate every 45 minutes, but their days were threaded with tasks that quietly shaped their entire societies. One wool-dyed tunic and hand-shucked pea at a time. Now imagine, if you will, the cobbled lanes of a medieval township, perhaps somewhere with a pleasant name like West Bumbleshire, where the air smells faintly of bread crusts, damp parchment, and the odd whiff of goat. Here, the day's work wasn't merely a job, it was identity, community, and ritual all bundled together in an apron. Take the blacksmith, for instance, a noble title bestowed upon the person who hit hot things with a hammer until they were useful. Horseshoes, tools, even the occasional work of medieval dental surgery when molars got unruly. He was a sort of artistic bruiser with a forge instead of a studio. And while you or I might dread a Monday for the local smith, every day bore the potential for fire, iron, and a great many opinions about the tensile strength of rivets. Meanwhile, over in the spinning shed, perhaps nestled behind a cluster of thatched cottages, a group of women prepared wool in a social cloud of lint and gossip. Their conversations swirled through the air, discussing births, bad oats, and whether old Myrtle's new suitor was perhaps a few spoons short of a draw. They spun fibers not just into thread, but into the very fabric of their status, as domestic productivity played a powerful role in what passed for a respectable life. It was cottage industry, in the literal drafty, slightly sheep-scented sense. Lest we forget, the miller, keeper of grains and suspicions. You see, in pre-modern villages, the local miller often enjoyed not only a crucial job, but also a slightly dodgy reputation. That's because villagers had to bring their grain to him for grinding, and he was known to take a little creative commission. A scoop here, a handful there, always strictly to keep the stones oiled, of course. Naturally, this led to the stereotype of the miller as someone who winked a bit too much and possibly wore shoes lined with flour and ethical ambiguity. And what kind of society would West Bumbleshire be without its market day? Every week, the work of the week spilled onto trestle tables, straw mats, and barrels turned sideways. Goods were bartered, coins exchanged hands with theatrical sighs, and the town's chickens expressed their opinions firmly and frequently between baskets of cabbages. Housewives became diplomats, grocers became philosophers, and there was always that one lad selling suspiciously sparkly trout, who swore they were fresh from the river this morning, though it had not rained for 3 fortnights, and the river now mostly contained frogs contemplating retirement. Elsewhere, monks in quiet abbeys laboured too, their work mostly silent, save the scratching of quills and the occasional medieval sneeze echoing off stone. Here was labour of the mind, copying manuscripts, illuminating pages with golden vines and suspiciously smug-looking cherubs. It was divine devotion expressed through elegant cursive and ink-stained fingers, a sort of holy office cubicle, just with more incense and fewer sticky notes. Even children had their roles. It was not uncommon for an 8-year-old to be handed a broom and told, "Start with the stables and end with your soul." They carried water, chased poultry, and learned from an early age that playtime often involved chasing rogue piglets, who were not, in fact, part of a game. But with all this ceaseless working, from sunrise to soup time, there was also rhythm, community, and yes, a kind of joy. A grain threshed by hand may not sound thrilling now, but when the entire village shared in the feasting afterward, it became more than labour. It became celebration. And this, you see, is what we often miss in our glowing modern cubes and corporate slack threads. The poetry, in peeling parsnips together, the slow satire of watching bread rise, the comedy of slipping in cow muck mid-task and laughing until your sides ached. As dusk wraps its linen scarf around the day, we gently leave behind the hammering, spinning, scribbling and shining of yesterday's work. For what lies ahead is another layer of the story, where work danced not just in the village square, but under palace ceilings and the perfumed shadows of royal halls. When the sun nestled low over the tiled roofs of ancient Rome, casting long shadows across bathhouses and bustling fora, a peculiar rhythm guided the city's heartbeat, the rhythm of daily work. Not just the heavy lifting of marble blocks or scribes fretting over taxes, but the peculiar, often strangely specific jobs that somehow existed in one of the world's greatest empires. Take, for example, the Sagarius, a man whose sole profession was folding cloaks, not sewing them, not washing them, not even selling them, folding. With the air of an origami master and the dedication of a Roman senator delivering a speech about grain allocation, the Sagarius would tuck, crease, and flap woolen garments into submission. They took their work seriously because in Rome, appearances mattered. And a poorly folded toga, scandalous. These highly specialized roles were a necessity in a society that thrived on order and hierarchy. Everyone, even the lowest onion seller, had their lane to stay in. The result? A workforce of charmingly narrow experts, tooth pullers who probably knew more about screaming than dentistry, professional mourners conditioned to weep with convincing despair at strangers' funerals, and, because Romans loved hygiene almost as much as they loved uncooked oaths and scandalous poetry, there were even full-time latrine attendants. These noble workers ensured the communal toilets flowed freely. Now imagine explaining that job at a dinner party. Yet for all its organizational pickiness, Rome's commitment to daily industry extended beyond her dramatic capital. Out in the provinces, pottery centres hummed, olive presses groaned, and wool weavers counted sheep not for sleep, but to advance their inventory. The Mediterranean, it turns out, was one long conveyor belt of amphorae and fermented fish sauce. And then there were the roads. Oh, the Roman roads. Built precisely, maintained obsessively, and occasionally cursed loudly when mules refused to cooperate. These stone veins stitched together the empire, and maintaining them was a job both enduring and dusty. Road crews patch potholes with the same zeal a grandmother applies to a quilt. And somewhere in the dusty distance, a centurion probably cursed that his sandals, quote, weren't made for logistics. Most endearingly, no matter their prestige or position, Romans defined themselves by their work. Even emperors bragged about their labours. Though to be fair, ruling an empire of tempestuous, senators and dramatic poets might have qualified as emotional labour. The Emperor Hadrian, for instance, loved architecture so much he insisted on designing parts of his own villa. His architects, no doubt blinking nervously, mustered polite approval and furrowed their brows in a way that suggested both awe and mild panic. But daily work in Rome wasn't strictly utilitarian. It spilled into leisure, blurred into ritual. Bakers offered doughy sacrifices to kitchen gods. Blacksmiths muttered blessings to Vulcan before firing up the forge. Even graffiti artists, bless their scandalous hearts, left behind cheeky notes on frescoed walls. One raunchy inscription in Pompeii reads, "We two dear men, friends forever, made this place wet with our laughter and other things." Work, it seems, included a healthy dose of mischief. And while men busied themselves with politics, posturing, and public bathing at awkward temperatures, women laboured across quieter but essential spheres. From wet nurses to domestic spinners, their work spun the fabric of everyday life, literally. The Roman matron was both administrator and craftswoman, capable of organising a household with military precision while embroidering a tunic that could rival the household budget. Talk about multitasking. Night in Rome crept in not suddenly, but with the mood of a dinner guest reluctant to interrupt. Oil lamps flickered to life. Vendors packed up their wares. Cloak folders brushed wool fibres off weary knees. And in the growing hush of the evening, one could hear the echo of footsteps. Workers returning home, stomachs rumbling, minds idling toward the next labour. But not everyone rested. Torchbearers continued their shifts. Bakers began theirs. The city's labour, like a never-ending play, changed acts but never stopped. And in the stillness between the sounds, Rome breathed, full-bellied with industry, half asleep with pride. Next, we wander east, where another world of daily toil unfolded beneath sun-baked courtyards and shadowed ziggurats, whispering of clay tablets and very serious beards. As the moon glides slowly over the thatched rooftops of medieval towns, we drift next into the curious rhythm of time, the clockless kind. Imagine, if you will, a world before alarms buzzed indignantly at 6 a.m., before Google Calendars had you color-coded to the minute. A world when the sun called the shots and roosters were, unfortunately, the closest thing to a personal assistant. In the echoing centuries before the mechanical clock ticked into dominance, most people experienced time as a wriggly, flexible little creature. And nothing taught you about time quite like work. Let's wander into a village scene of the 12th century. The kind with muddy lanes, clanking buckets, and a strong national commitment to goats. A peasant named Matilda wakes up not because a bell rang, but because light filters through the cracks of her wooden shutters. She stretches, hears the lowing of oxen and the squawk of chickens, and just knows it's morning, and that means labour. Her schedule isn't posted anywhere, it's lived. The sowing of barley is dictated not by a calendar reminder, but by the feel of the air on her skin. Muckier than usual. Rain's coming. Better finish those furrows. There's a word for this fuzzy mapping of time, natural time. And though it may sound romantic, it did make hosting brunch nearly impossible. You see, to live by natural time meant syncing with chickens and clouds far more than with written hours on paper. One did not say, "Meet me at 3 p.m., but rather, "Meet me when the sun is just above the tallest oak," or "Once the sheep are nicely drowsy under the elm." Understandably, lateness was rampant and hard to measure unless you had a particularly judgmental sundial. In cities, however, something interesting took root. By the 14th century, urban centres started getting punctual. As towns bustled with merchants, guilds, and an alarming number of bakers, time needed some sharpening. Monasteries had long been dividing the day into prescribed prayer hours, with bells tolling the canonical hours like lauds, prime, terce, and so forth. These bells began trickling out into the secular world, helping everyone chime in, literally, on what time it was. Imagine you're in Florence in the year 1350. The church bell booms from Santa Croce, and everyone nods knowingly, terce, time to work at the loom again. Or in your case, apprentice under a very dramatic spice merchant who insists nutmeg is more valuable than gold, and might not be wrong, considering the medieval spice trade. Gradually, public clocks emerged, towering mechanical marvels that didn't so much tick as thunk. These were not delicate wristwatches, but enormous gears lumbering toward the top of each hour, usually miscalibrated by a good 20 minutes. Still, they gave form to a previously squishy concept. Hours became a unit for planning, for segmenting labor, for arguing, at last, about being 5 minutes late. The newfound rigidity of time didn't just tick in cities, it chimed into contracts. In England, labourers' hours were increasingly legislated after the Black Death lowered the workforce and sent wages skyrocketing, much to the displeasure of aristocrats who enjoyed the idea of people working longer and for less. Enter the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, a spectacularly unpopular document that tried to corral both wages and working hours with all the success of herding cats armed with pitchforks. Yet even with these regulations, much of daily work was still guided by light. Candle shortages in winter ensured that early sunrises were prized, and long evenings were for lounging or, if one was ambitious, committing minor candle crimes. On manorial estates, labour was still seasonal. The ploughing, sowing, and harvesting danced to nature's own tempo. But in cities like Ghent or Milan, workshops began operating on rigid schedules. Apprentices rose to clangy bells, worked long hours under oil lamps, and probably dreamed of simpler times when time itself was only vaguely understood, and naps were sacred. All of this change was knitted into the fabric of daily life without anyone quite noticing the revolution at hand. Time, once a whisper from the wind, was now a shouted command from the bell tower. But do not fret for the yeoman or spinning maid. Even in the clangour of industrial chiming, there remained generous pockets of timelessness, moments snatched in the warmth of an afternoon sunbeam, or stolen under the table at a feast, where someone may have just spilled ale on the hourglass. Again, as twilight settles on the old world and our historical dreamscape quiets, we'll follow the trail of bells and gears toward the evolution of something surprisingly intimate, the workplace. Yes, that strange zone where people gather to both labour and, let's be honest, invent sneaky ways to avoid it. Across the ancient hills of Anatolia, while the sun rose with the same slowness as a bureaucrat in a toga, a very important type of noise began to populate the morning air. Not the chirping of birds, not the clanging of weapons, but the steady tap-thud of looms. Yes, looms, the ancient equivalent of today's humble office printer, but louder, bulkier, and with a tendency to shed bits of goat hair. You see, weaving wasn't just a chore. It was an art, a livelihood, and often a secret language of economic power, spoken in warp and weft. In Bronze Age households, the warmest rooms were those filled not with good company, but rather with busy fingers coaxing meaning from bundles of dyed thread. This was an era when textiles meant wealth, and the people producing this wealth were often women, hunkered over vertical looms, quietly changing the shape of commerce. Homes were less like peaceful retreats and more like small factories. Domestic space and workspace were the same, which meant one could nurse a child with one hand and card wool with the other. Daily work, in the most literal sense, shaped society. Civilizations rose not just on bronze or conquest, but on well-spun wool and the careful deployment of spindles. In Mesopotamia, scribes recorded entire inventories of textiles, with the solemnity usually reserved for battles or royal weddings. A bolt of cloth was currency, tribute, and fashion, all in one. Imagine turning in your taxes via a tapestry. And yet, such was life. Even higher up the social ladder, work was a marker of functionality. In ancient Rome, ladies of senatorial households might not weave full-time, but they still observed the respectable fiction that they were engaged in useful labor. Spinning and weaving were seen as dignified, almost sacred duties tied to female virtue. The matron Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi brothers, was once said to have scorned jewels in favor of showing off her well-educated sons. But chances are, someone in her household, probably many someones, was churning out togas with royal precision. Speaking of togas, they came with requirements. A toga wasn't just a bedsheet reenacting a dramatic swoop. It was regulation wear for Roman citizenship events, funerals, and the kind of political speeches that made the Senate feel important. And they required quite a bit of fabric, hundreds of folds, pleats that would make an origami master tremble. All that fabric needed to come from somewhere, and someone needed to work daily to produce it. But if that all sounds a bit fibrous, allow me to take you to the soft, slow swirl of early Chinese silk production. A calmer place where silkworms munched away diligently in mulberry groves, producing treasure one tiny thread at a time. Now, silk was more than mere fabric. It was a whisper along trade routes, a shimmering link between Himalayas and hangars of empire. In a calm room with paper windows and a slow-burning fire, women would carefully unwind cocoons, sometimes for hours at a time. The labor was annoyingly precise. Ruin one cocoon, and it was back to step one. Yet, from these meticulous, unwinding sessions, came robes fit for emperors, scarves for diplomats, and enough wealth to keep silk smugglers in business for centuries. Meanwhile, in a darkened hallway, somewhere in medieval Europe, a flax-breaker leaned on his bundle and sighed. Linen production wasn't glamorous work. There was soaking in barrels, pounding with mallets, combing with iron teeth, not unlike trying to groom a very uncooperative lion made entirely of plant fiber. But the result was the fine, crisp linen that monks wore, that babies were swaddled in, and that queens threw over their shoulders as they solemnly judged courtly dramas involving love, land, and livestock. Through it all, daily work had a strange duality. It was invisible, yet everywhere, mundane yet vital, left out of heroic poems, yet inscribed quietly into the rhythm of societies surviving, thriving, and occasionally collapsing underneath their own to-do lists. Even the longshoreman unloading jars of garum in a Mediterranean port, or the peasant woman dyeing cloth with fermented indigo 3 villages inland, all were part of a larger loom, weaving not just fabric, but the very pattern of civilization. And tomorrow, the hearth fires would rekindle at dawn, the tools would creak back to life, and once again, The looms, the distaffs, the hammers, and the flax combs would take their places, keeping history quietly beating beneath the grand sound of kings and conquests. Which makes you wonder, how did we get from flax and silk to punch cards and factory bells? And when did the rhythm of individual hands become the hum of machines? We'll drift there next, gently, through the foggy factory windows of another time, in the quiet glow of a pre-industrial morning, when roosters filled the role that smartphones now jealously guard. People across the globe were already elbow-deep in the day's labor, not because they were morning people. Oh no, those poor souls weren't gulping down herbal tea and stretching into downward dog for pleasure. They were just awake, because not spinning wool or fetching water or wrangling geese simply meant not having lunch, or possibly not having a roof by winter. But here's the cozy twist. This daily grind, this endless ritual of wake up, toil, repeat, was far more than just the drudgery of survival. It forged the rhythms of early societies in ways that were oddly artistic, sometimes ingenious, and always a little bit weird. Take medieval monks, for instance. Their work was tied directly to time, but not time as we know it, rather time as sung bells and candle stubs. In abbeys across Europe, their days were parcelled out not merely by chores or meals, but by the divine office. A schedule of chanting prayers at very specific hours, matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, vespers at twilight. Nestled between these sacred sound bites were hours spent copying manuscripts, tending gardens, brewing beer, hallelujah, and illuminating letters with gold leaf so sparkly it would have made a Renaissance glitter enthusiast weep. This sacred scheduling spilled over into larger society. Bells from nearby monasteries gave farmers cues to begin or pause work. Villagers even measured time pass by, how far into the liturgy Brother Gregory had chanted before they heard him snore through the cloister wall. Meanwhile, in medieval towns, time was marked a little more traumatically by the bell tower known ominously as the work bell. At dawn, it rang, jerking cobblers and coopers from their coarse straw beds. At dusk, it rang again, announcing not rest, no, don't get comfy, but curfew, derived from the French couvre-feu, literally cover the fire. A reminder to extinguish flames, huddle in, and generally not light the village on fire overnight. Riveting advice. But medieval folk weren't mindlessly trudging through each day. Their work was founded on collective rhythms. Markets, festivals, saint days, seasonal fairs. These all punctuated the work calendar with pockets of noise and colour, and, if you were lucky, some roasted chestnuts and poorly tuned fiddles. Work and play weren't cleanly separated. They were threads spun together. You might find a blacksmith humming a drinking song mid-hammer, or a weaver pausing her loom to gossip about the hay merchant's scandalously short tunic. And over in early China, all this wasn't much different, except there, cosmic order took center stage. The emperor's court clocked the season's shift with a mix of astronomy, state ritual, and gloomy Confucian lectures. Daily work for peasants matched the movement of stars and the ever-watchful civil calendar. Before you planted your rice, someone quite scholarly had determined it was astrologically a very good day for soil moisture. That man probably hadn't touched a hoe in his life. Still, in imperial bureaucracies, work worked. Local scribes filed reports, tax collectors collected, and somewhere, likely in exasperation, a mid-level administrator had to explain why one village contributed 3 pigs and a musical melon to the annual tribute rather than the prescribed sacks of millet. Some jobs, it seems, were as absurd then as they are now. Then, far from the paper-strewn desks of the East or the chanting cloisters of Europe, we meet a world where daily work floated by sea breeze. Yes, ancient island societies. Think Polynesia. Here, tasks like fishing, weaving mats, or carving canoes were not only labor, but acts of artistry infused with deep spiritual meaning. A well-built canoe wasn't just transportation. It was the skeletal form of community. Each notch and curve whispered of ancestry and nourishment. Work was an extension of self, tribe, and the stars above. And in the cool shade of the palm, between shimmers of ocean light, you might find elders teaching children how to tie knots, spin cord, or sing to the rhythms of paddle strokes. It's strange, but comforting, how all these people across wildly different worlds still rose with the light, worked with their hands, their backs, their minds, and eventually wound their way to a humble evening filled with food, fires, and the grunted joy of a finished day. And so, as twilight spills over yet another historical hearth, we drift onwards toward the flickering glow of work's quiet companion, leisure, and the curious places it took us. Think for a moment of your average baker. Maybe they rise early, dust flour across the counter like a child spilling magic powder, and spend their day elbow deep in dough. Now imagine being a baker in ancient Rome, where your work not only nourished a city, but occasionally found itself regulated with almost imperial flair. Bread wasn't just food. It was politics, public service, and a slight risk to your kneecaps if the loaves were too small. Indeed, to understand how daily work shaped ancient societies, we must tiptoe into the warm, yeasty aroma of Roman bakeries. A place where labor was essential, life was rhythmic, and everything smelled vaguely of wheat and civic obligation. In Rome, bread wasn't merely a bakery item. It was a cornerstone of state stability. The phrase bread and circuses, or panem et circenses, wasn't invented for nothing. The state provided bread to the masses as a kind of edible peace treaty. As long as the grains were flowing and the gladiators were swinging, the population would stay marginally calm, give or take a rebellion or two. But this meant that bakers, lowly as they might have appeared, held a strange kind of power. The grain supply was tracked more obsessively than a teenage emperor's horoscope, and bakers were conscripted into a guild system known as the Collegium Pistorum. Members of this guild, once inducted, were about as free to quit as a marble statue is to leave its pedestal. In fact, you could inherit your father's bakery, whether you liked bread or not, and refusing, could invite a visit from someone with sandals, a scroll, and very persuasive eyebrows. Work in a Roman bakery was no dainty affair. Bakers and their teams would hurl themselves into pre-dawn kneading marathons under the flickering light of oil lamps. Gigantic rotary querns, grain-grinding devices operated by donkeys or enslaved workers, churned and grumbled like aloof relatives. The mills were relentless, the ovens blazingly hot, and the penalties for short-weight loaves equally fiery. And yet amidst this furnace of toil, there were remarkable inventions. Bakers used sophisticated brick ovens, complete with domed roofs and glowing embers, able to create crusts so revered they'd end up carved into tombstones. Yes, truly, some bakers commemorated their careers in stone, proudly depicting loaves in bas relief, proving once and for all that carbs can indeed be a legacy. The loaves themselves were typically circular, often scored into 8 sections and stamped with marks of the bakery, part brand identity, part Roman bureaucracy. Imagine the ancient version of best before dates chiseled in dough, A slight error in marking might mean your bread ended up confiscated by an overzealous food inspector with toga and temper intact. Beyond the bakers, other daily workers kept this city of marble and murmured gossip humming. The fullones, or fullers, ancient launderers, engaged in work that was both essential and exquisitely unpleasant. They cleaned clothes using fermented urine, a surprisingly effective but nose-wrinkling technique. Urine, after all, contains ammonia, which breaks down stains, and also, apparently, social enthusiasm. Laundries dotted the urban landscape, and at any given time you might hear a symphony of stomping, sloshing, and scrubbing as fullers tread garments in vats with a dedication unmatched by even the most earnest spa-goer. Citizens would bring togas soiled by everyday wear and occasionally catastrophic banquets, and receive them back suitably cleansed, brighter, and perhaps just faintly acidic. Other guilds tied into daily toil with equal parts humour and hardship. The fabbri, craftsmen responsible for everything from bronze hinges to the fiddly bits on siege engines, often organised into organised trade networks. Tools were passed down like sacred relics, hammers, chisels, and of course, that one overly chatty apprentice no one could quite get rid of. And hovering behind these trades, unglamorous yet omnipresent, were women, working not just in the home but in market stalls, textile workshops, even temple service. These weren't idle figures in the frescoes, brushing hair or passing fruit. They wove, brewed, and bartered, often managing household businesses with such practical brilliance that it made some senators uncertain whether democracy was such a good idea after all. Work, in these ancient rhythms, had a pulse. It structured life, echoed in footsteps crossing stone pavements, and set a tempo to civic rituals. Society, in a sense, was held together by the bakery's oven heat, the fuller's suds, the clang of the bronze workshop, and the whispered negotiations of market women. And just beyond those working hands and weary shoulders lies another layer of everyday effort, the kind not etched into stone or shouted in elections, but quietly stitched, painted, and brewed into the culture itself. The next flicker of candlelight will drift us gently there. By moonlight or candle glow, depending on the century and local fire regulations, countless ancient bakers began their work long before the rest of their town had even thought of stretching. The world over, the art of early rising has belonged to the bread makers, those puffy-palmed magicians who transformed flour, water, and elbow grease into sustenance and civilization. This is not merely a tale of yeasty enterprise. No, tonight, we slip into the flour-dusted aprons of history's most dependable workforce, the people who fed society in every sense of the word. Picture this: an early morning in ancient Rome. The city is not yet awake, except for a few slaves scurrying about with amphoras tucked under their arms, and a legion of bakers already elbow-deep in dough. Roman bakers, or pistores, held a peculiar spot, technically essential to the empire, but socially ranked somewhere between salt merchant and amateur gladiator. In the earliest days of Rome, bread was a bubbling porridge affair. Then came the Greeks, with their love of loaves, and changed everything. Romans took to it with characteristic enthusiasm, establishing commercial bakeries as far back as the 2nd century BCE. The remains of Pompeii's bakeries, frozen in tragic ash, still show the stone mills, kneading areas, and even the carbonized bread, a crusty relic, forever waiting for its pat of ancient butter. Rome even created a professional guild, the Collegium Pistorum, because if you're going to rise before dawn every day to poke dough, you may as well unionize. Members were exempt from military service, because imagine a legion short on baguettes. The horror. But Rome didn't have the dough market cornered. Moving east, across the sands and centuries, we find ourselves in 12th century Baghdad, where a stroll through the souk in the cool before sunrise could guide you by scent alone. There, bakers were viewed with reverence, especially those who specialized in flatbreads so delicate they could be folded like poetry. The caliphs of the Abbasid dynasty enjoyed sweet breads, perfumed with rosewater and cardamom, a taste fashionable long before French patisserie had its moment. Work in these bakeries was less a job and more a choreography. One tossed dough, another rolled, a third sizzled on a hot stone surface, while the final act delivered the warm product to an eager crowd. Bread wasn't merely a food here. It was an edible language, a communal offering, a round, delicious handshake between neighbors. Across the Alps in medieval Europe, bakers had slightly tougher dough to knead. Regulations were strict, ovens were few, and the risk of scorch marks, both culinary and reputational, was ever present. Bread was the staple of the ever-grumbling peasant stomach, and though grain prices rose and fell with every breeze that rustled through a lord's wheat field, bread had to remain available, so laws were enforced. The assize of bread and ale, a delightfully bureaucratic bit of 13th century English law, set fixed weights and prices for bread to avoid both famine and cheating, a heroic, if crust-bound, attempt at economic fairness. Bakers caught shortchanging their bread loaves were sometimes punished by, amusingly, being thrown into their own ovens, not fatally, one hopes, but just enough to make them really consider their loaf's moral center. This, we suspect, is perhaps where the term "getting roasted" originated. Now, if we waft further east and a little later in the night, perhaps into feudal Japan, we'll find that rice, not bread, served as the starch of the masses. But that didn't mean the Japanese kitchen lacked the early risers and methodical stirrers who define all society's food makers. In Kyoto, Buddhist monks rose before dawn to prepare offerings and simple meals, starchy miso, pickles, and rice gruel, that nourished both body and spirit. Work here was worship, and while there was no yeast, there was plenty of reverence. Work done in kitchens, ovens, and grain-swept courtyards shaped not only diets, but daily rhythms, societal roles, and even the built environment. Entire neighborhoods formed around bakers, public ovens, and shared supply chains. In this soft, flour-coated revolution, we see the shape of society, literal and metaphorical loaves rising together. So as we stretch lightly with the first crackle of imagined firewood and let the scent of ancient bread lull our thoughts, we drift gently into the next rhythm of the working world, one not bound by yeast or hourglasses, but still tethered to daily toil, the unexpected labor of medieval public sanitation, the people who walked the dirtiest miles, so others didn't have to. Somewhere between the clink of iron tools and the gentle sweep of horse-drawn plows, humanity quietly invented Tuesday. No one really remembers deciding that, but there it was, just appearing reliably after Monday and before Wednesday. And for many medieval folks, it meant something in particular. Work as usual, but perhaps less dramatic than Sunday's strict devotion or Thursday's market chaos. Tucked into the early hum of a week already underway, the inhabitants of villages from Yorkshire to the Rhineland returned to their crafts and tasks. Bakers rolled dough atop smooth wooden counters worn thin by generations of wrist flicks. Candle makers dipped wicks into cauldrons of tallow in long, hypnotic rhythms. And a man with a notably large hat fussed thoroughly over his neighbor's donkey harness. because he may not have been especially good at his own trade, but boy, did he have unsolicited advice to give. Daily work, in its reliable repetition, created something too often overlooked in grand tales of kings and battles, the glue of society, the rhythm of life, and perhaps by accident, some of history's best unshared jokes. One such craft deserving of sleepy applause is that of the medieval scribe. Imagine a cloister hushed by the weight of silence and the scent of ink and sheep parchment. There, hunched over their desks, scribes painstakingly copied religious texts, royal decrees, and occasionally their own little complaints in the margins. Yes, nestled beside delicate Latin verses, you'll find notes like, "Oh my hand," or "This parchment is too thin." Once, a scribe even wrote, "I am very cold," perhaps the truest historical whisper we could ever wish for. Meanwhile, in bustling towns, cobblers stitch leather soles with a precision envied by many and noticed by few. To these humble artists, shoes were symphonies stitched in sinew and patience. A mismatched boot could send an entire footpath into philosophical crisis. Well, perhaps not quite. But imagine walking unevenly in a world before podiatrists. It's the minor discomforts that give us major appreciation. Then there were the blacksmiths, true rock stars of the clanging world. They turned raw metal into horseshoes, hinges, and occasionally questionable swords that may or may not have bent dramatically at the first clash. In towns across Europe and Asia, the forge was as essential as air, shaping kingdoms one stubborn ingot at a time. And if you ever wrote a poem about your favorite hammer, don't be embarrassed. Many did, because yes, folks were romantic about tools. Who wouldn't be, when that shovel fed your children and defended your cabbage patch? And speaking of cabbage, yes, the glamorous green orb of medieval significance. Farmers across civilizations tended to their vegetables with awe-inspiring perseverance. Whether coaxing barley from rocky Scottish hills or corralling goats with the enthusiasm of a badly written musical, these men and women created the heartbeat of local economies. Their work made possible not just dinner, but gossip, which brings us nicely to laundry. Before the gentle hum of washing machines drove away our daydreams, clothes were scrubbed beside rivers and beaten on stones with enough fervour to rival an opera finale. In ancient Rome, launderers, known as fullers, used fermented urine as a type of detergent. It sounds unpleasant, and it was, but the city sparkled, and the sheets smelled vaguely of, well, vinegar and consequence. Yet even this was a kind of alchemy, a powerful routine that made order from chaos, folding the fabric of society both literally and metaphorically. Much further east, in Heian-era Japan, daily life for aristocrats involved layers, literally layers of silk robes, each chosen with almost comical precision for color coordination. Court ladies composed poems with each clothing change, assigning deep seasonal or emotional meaning to shades of plum and moss green. Imagine needing a haiku before breakfast just to get dressed, and through it all, from continent to continent, culture to culture, daily work hummed like a lullaby sung by calloused hands. From the baker's warm oven to the scribe's icy desk, from the farmer's crooked hoe to the candle maker's flickering ceiling shadows, humanity moved forward not with drama, but with diligence. Repeated gestures, familiar motions, errors and corrections passed like secrets from palm to palm. It wasn't always noble. It was rarely glamorous, but it was deeply, profoundly human. Somewhere, the sound of a spinning wheel sighed through the rafters. A cat curled next to a weaving loom, An attired apprentice rested their head on a pile of nearly acceptable walnuts they'd spent the entire day sorting. And in the back of a quiet mill house, where flour painted every surface like old snow, someone leaned back and thought, without saying it to anyone at all, "Well, that's enough for today." But just up the road, someone else lit a lantern, because the night shift was only just beginning. Among the most whimsical corners of history lies something quietly profound: the people who watched paint dry. Yes, before you drift into a chuckle, consider this. In the workshops and studios of Renaissance Italy, apprentices were literally hired to sit and monitor frescoes as they dried, not because anyone had a particular fondness for pigment evaporation, but because one ill-timed sneeze or a gust of wind could permanently warp Michelangelo's latest depiction of a muscular saint. Somewhere in Florence, in the chalky hush of a sunlit room, a teenage apprentice named Gianni probably stared at a half-damp wall for 8 uninterrupted hours, occasionally fluttering his fan at a fly that had the nerve to explore St. Peter's halo. Important work, at a glacial pace. But then, that's the curious thing about daily work in early societies. It didn't always look heroic. In fact, much of it was defined by careful inaction. The blacksmith had muscle, sure, but he also needed to wait for iron to cool just enough to strike. The medieval washerwoman did her most crucial labor while water boiled. Farmers stood leaning on hoes, not lazy, just listening to breezes and insects, decoding nature's very specific tempo. In the Andes, for instance, Incan farmers didn't use wheels, plows, or beeping tractor attachments. No, their daily work involved reading the land like a manuscript, adjusting terraces, consulting stars, and whispering to potatoes, probably. The Inca didn't write much down, but they knew their soil types like modern baristas know bean roasts. And each morning, they stepped with reverence into mountain fields, as if the hills themselves held secrets best uncovered one cautious dig at a time. Meanwhile, ancient Chinese silk farmers had a level of daily dedication that bordered on the obsessive. Raising silkworms was a universal lesson in patience. The little critters required soft mulberry leaves, perfect humidity, and absolutely no stress. Even a domestic dispute in the next room could spook them into threadless silence. Some households went full monastery, whispering, gliding in slippers, and never, ever sneezing. Across the Mediterranean, Greek potters sat in the same 3-legged stool for decades, slowly shaping vessels not only for wine but for eternity. They etched little mythological dramas on them. Yes, gods eating grapes, minotaurs being confused in labyrinths. But while hands moved fluidly, minds wandered. The repetition of work made thinkers out of artisans. Socrates himself might have strolled past a kiln in Athens, asking a glazed-over potter mid-spin, "What is justice really?" Only to be answered, "Justice is letting me finish this amphora without philosophical interruptions." Even court scribes had their share of meditative tedium. Imagine a hunched Egyptian copyist in Thebes, meticulously drawing lotus flowers in blue ink, while fellow scribes debated whether cats should be addressed formally in legal documents. A simple edit could take all day, especially when erasers weren't invented yet, and hieroglyphs couldn't be backspaced. And yet, in all this slowness, there was a quiet triumph. These workers weren't racing clocks. They were shaping societies. Their rhythms mapped out the heartbeat of civilizations long gone. One brushstroke, one spindle twist, one mule cart delivery of amphorae at a time. Time itself behaved differently back then. Without wristwatches ticking ominously, people worked by light and birdsong. When the mid-afternoon sun began to tilt like a simmering pot, that was your cue to wrap up. The passage of a shadow was a schedule. A cough from the village square cook signalled nearing dinner time. And when it rained, well, everyone agreed a nap was more than justified. Even in the bustling bazaars of Baghdad, the subtle art of negotiation spilled into daily labour. Merchants spent hours perfecting how to slowly pretend they didn't care about making a sale. You had to feign complete disinterest in a rug you had just spent 3 months importing from Persia. "This thing," the seller would mumble, casually stroking its wool as though to lull it into hibernation. You don't need it." And that ritualistic back and forth, called haggling, was as much work as weaving. So much of ancient work wasn't about hustle and grind, but about ritual, rhythm, and restraint. A million tiny pauses practiced to near perfection. The crux of daily life was not speeding up, but sinking in. Sinking with sun, with season, with the sigh between hammer strokes. And as twilight fell across centuries and continents, many hands loosened their grip on tools, not from exhaustion, but from knowing that the task, however small, belonged to something much larger, a world slowly spinning on the axis of work well done. Let's wander now to a place where time was measured in tides and labour was softened by salt air. The coastlines were busy too, just differently. Fisherfolk and dockhands await us by moonlight, already half listening to the sea's gentle yawn. The moon hung low over the dunes of North Africa, casting silvery shadows on the stone walls of ancient Carthage. A city of traders, tacticians, and rather industrious street vendors, Carthage was a humming port of daily work rhythms, the kind that makes the archaeological record smell faintly of olive oil and ambition. Now, while Rome and Greece may have more columned ruins to hog the spotlight, Carthage was no slacker. Its Punic inhabitants were masters of commerce, proven by the fact that they managed to irritate Rome simply by existing so efficiently. Their workday was a tempo of trade winds, marketplace chatter, and that ever-reliable Mediterranean sun that practically forced you to stay productive before noon or perish from sunstroke. Daily labour in Carthage was a well-oiled economic ballet. Merchants hawked fabrics, dyes, and exotic resins brought in on boats so packed they probably floated entirely by shared entrepreneurial spirit. Dock workers, with arms like mythological furniture, heaved amphorae full of wine and garum, because no ancient trade route was complete without jars of fermented fish sauce sloshing around like defiant picnic coolers. Behind this hotbed of economic vigour were the scribes, the unsung, heroes with the styluses and sleep deprivation. It was they who balanced accounts, filed trade permits, and probably complained about their cramped hands in Phoenician cursive. Their ink, almost certainly made from soot and regret, preserved ledgers that helped Carthage swim in silver while trying not to drown in debt. Women, too, had roles in this economy, especially in textiles. Weaving was serious work, and a loom could be both a productive tool and a very attentive listener, depending on who you asked. Many Carthaginian women ran household industries, with spare rooms converted into productive workshops where the clack of wooden frames met the low hum of gossip. Local historians would later credit these homegrown operations with everything from boosting exports to innovating the first known method of complaining through fabric design. This is not just a tunic, one might say. It's an emotional landscape. But public life brought its own mechanics. City maintenance wasn't going to manage itself, and so municipal workers took to their duties with the slow-burning dedication that only comes from being paid in tax exemptions and salted fish. Street cleaners used brooms fashioned from palm fronds, and carpenters repaired doors and wagons, working with tools so simple they might as well have doubled as musical instruments in their off time. Poets. Oh yes, there were poets. Every city with a port eventually gets one. Nothing inspires verse quite like harrowing sea trade and overpriced figs. And yet, being a poet was hardly the soft life. These dreamy scribblers had to earn their keep. Some by tutoring the children of smugglers, others by reciting to mildly interested dinner guests who really just wanted to enjoy their lentils in peace. As for the spiritual side of the workday, Carthage had a rather intense relationship with their deities. The many rituals and offerings left at the temples were not simply noise and spectacle. They were industry. Priests and priestesses performed their elaborate roles with the devotional precision of celestial accountants, tracking divine investments. Incense was burned, sacred foods prepared, rituals calendared, and there were, how to put this gently, some rather extreme decisions made about appeasement. We'll not dwell. Let the statues hold those secrets under moonlight's hush. But perhaps the most revealing detail about ancient Carthaginian labor is this. They worked not merely for survival, but for stature. Success was a performance, a careful display of wealth, refinement, and influence. Much like curating a nice social media feed, except the filters were more literal, often made of lapis lazuli and rage. This performative labor shaped their public architecture, the city's symmetry, and even the wardrobe of those pretending not to care who saw them. The way a merchant tied his cloak, or a matron stitched a sleeve, held meaning. Work was image. Image was power. And when the sun began to sink behind the chain of seaside hills, Carthage slowed, just a little. Anchors dropped, rooftops filled with the scent of cooked grains and stewed greens, and daylight gave way to oil lamp talk. Deals made and deferred. Dreams whispered between bites. Even the scribes set down their pens. The economy would wait until dawn, and as the winds curled around the harbour quieted by nightfall, so too shall we drift toward a new land, where distant labourers toil under different stars, and where the rhythm of daily work carries a slightly cooler breeze. As twilight cloaked the high stone walls of medieval monasteries, a curious rhythm echoed through the cloisters. Not the clash of swords or the chatter of trade, but the soft shuffling of sandals and the rustle of manuscripts set to the gentle soundtrack of chanting. For in these sacred spaces, tucked away from the clang and clamour of feudal life, monks were quietly revolutionizing everyday work by doing it repeatedly, carefully, sometimes slowly enough to make snails look like sprinters. Now, monastic life was not the sleepy vacation it might appear. Far from it. Picture a life where rising before dawn wasn't optional, and breakfast came only after fixing the goat pen, copying 4 pages of Latin scripture, and attending a church service, all before sunrise cocktails, that is the blandest porridge imaginable. The monk's day was governed by the rule of St. Benedict, which had all the timetable flexibility of a Swiss train. 7 prayers per day, plus 1 in the middle of the night for good measure. Garden work, manuscript copying, and enough quiet reflection to make even a Buddhist monk say, "Wow, that's a bit much." But here's the wild thing. By going about their daily tasks with relentless consistency and contemplative calm, monks became the quiet engines of progress. Yes, they copied text so slowly that you can almost hear their ink-dipped feathers whispering across vellum centuries later. But these copies preserved ancient knowledge. one curl of a letter at a time. Monasteries essentially became the photocopiers, publishing houses, science labs, and tech support centers of the early Middle Ages. And all while wearing robes that made them look like oddly intellectual hobbits. But let's take a closer look at what they actually did all day when they weren't humming Gregorian chants, like they were stuck in the world's first choir rehearsal on repeat. First, there was scriptorium duty. Ah yes, the scriptorium, that hallowed chamber where the only sound was the scratching of quills and possibly the occasional sigh of regret upon spelling Augustinus wrong. On the last line of a 100-page manuscript, each monk would copy text with painstaking precision, not just holy scriptures, but sometimes medical treatises, histories, and even herbal encyclopedias, like the ones that might help you decide whether this particular root is a cure for gout, or just gives you stomach cramps from 1100 to eternity. Then came garden labor, because if you wanted to eat, you grew your food. We're talking hard-working monks tending beans, onions, herbs, and the all-important cabbage patch. Cabbage, you see, was the medieval answer to every culinary question. How do you spice up a bland meal? Add more cabbage. What's for dinner? Just. Also cabbage. What's that smell? Correct. It's cabbage. Laundry. Yes. Done by hand. Usually with lye soap strong enough to dissolve sins, and hopefully a few odors acquired during long meditation sessions in wool robes. But the monks weren't all ink and boiled greens. Some became unexpected innovators. Clockmaking, for example, got a monastic boost when monks needed something more reliable than a rooster to tell them when to sing again. Some monasteries even developed mechanical devices, basic water mills, elaborate calendars, and early timekeeping machines, which, to be fair, were the medieval equivalent of building an app just to avoid missing prayer hour. Monks also brewed beer, yes, beer, the blessed beverage of barley and clemency. And given medieval sanitation standards, monastic beer may well have been safer to drink than water. Many modern breweries still trace their foamy roots back to abbeys, where the humble combination of yeast and divine inspiration was refined into something rather heavenly. In essence, monastic life was one of deep spiritual duty intertwined with daily labor, toil not as punishment, but as devotion. Every weed pulled, every page inked, every cabbage boiled into submission. It was all for higher purpose, kind of like assembling IKEA furniture while reciting Latin hymns. Puzzling, certainly, but endlessly purposeful. And so, amid the sacred silences and rhythmic tasks of monastery life, daily work became a meditative dance, looping like clock hands over the centuries, keeping faith and knowledge alike ticking forward, one humble cabbage-filled day at a time. Now, as night candles flicker in cloister windows, casting sleepy shadows across old stone floors, let us gently step from the world of the pious and the punctual, and float softly towards stories of those whose labor took them not inside monastery walls, but out among the ploughs and seasonal winds. The world of work has always teetered on a wonderfully wobbly line between necessity and artistry, and nowhere is this more whimsically evident than in the peculiar case of medieval scribes, those ink-stained introverts who effectively copy-pasted entire books before printing presses got too clever for parchment. In the dim glow of candlelight, tucked inside monasteries that smelled faintly of beeswax and existential dread, monks and scribes bent over stretched vellum pages, transcribing scriptures, scientific texts, and the occasional scandal-ridden satirical poem, with handwriting so dainty it could gilt a quill into behaving. These folks made spelling more of a lifestyle than a rule, and their patience could have humbled glaciers. Each day began not with a morning latte, of course, but with prayer, then stretching their finger joints like tiny illuminated yoga instructors, preparing for yet another 4-hour debate on the ideal Latin abbreviation for etc. In theory, the role of the scribe was holy. In practice, it was a ceaseless string of minute corrections, poorly sharpened quills, and the looming terror of starting over after an ink blot decided to betray you on page 324 of 370. Then there were the marginalia. Oh, the marginalia. As a tool for coping, or possibly slowly losing their minds, scribes often scribbled little fanciful figures in the not-so-unused margins of sacred pages. Bunnies jousting, knights battling snails, priests being chased by angry birds well before Twitter made that a thing. It's as if, somewhere between psalms and papal orders, they allowed themselves the gentlest rebellion, inserting doodles that whisper, across centuries, "Yes, I see you. I too was bored." The celebrated Lindisfarne Gospels, for example, looked less like a book and more like a liturgical kaleidoscope. Every swirl of ink, every precise interlace of colour, tells us two things: that medieval monastic life held equal parts devotion and detail obsession, and that someone back then definitely needed glasses. Still, the work had its own rhythms, and in a world without status updates or phone pings, the act of writing, slow, deliberate, looping ink into permanence, was meditative, even luxurious, not unlike hand-binding your own planner in 2023, but with considerably more God and considerably fewer sticker options. Now, while the scribes were soothingly scratching at stories, their less literary peers, the professional bell ringers, were also hard at work orchestrating the oral clocks of medieval Europe. These sonic specialists weren't just tasked with bonging the big brass babies at regular hours. Oh no, it was a full auditory language. Every bell had a purpose. One toll called monks to prayer. Another warned of an incoming Viking with poor manners. Work, as the bell would remind you, was both relentless and sacred. Then there's the curious case of the town crier. Arguably history's first newsletter, delivered with great vocal projection and a very stylish hat. Before literacy trickled down to the masses like medieval Wi-Fi, the crier shouted updates to the town square, always beginning with an oyez, oyez, a phrase that roughly translates to "listen up, peasants, this bit's important." The town crier's job blended public service with sheer lung capacity, and with no microphones, they were essentially human megaphones in frilly pants. Even during moments of civic tension, executions, rising taxes, or new local bylaws forbidding the juggling of ferrets, the town crier remained composed and weirdly enthusiastic. One could not simply whisper justice after all. It's heartwarming to imagine these seemingly mundane roles: candle watcher, bell ringer, letter elongator, all pulsing quietly at the center of daily life, like the soft ticking of a village clock. None of it urgent in our time, but desperately so in theirs. Work, for much of history, wasn't just toil either. It was a kind of steady tether to the world spinning around it. The longer you look, the more you realize that history's workers weren't racing toward productivity, but dancing to a slower, stranger rhythm. They measured life in strokes of ink and chimes of bronze, and in between, they wrestled goats, patched cloaks, and occasionally, very occasionally, jousted snails in pen-drawn dreams. Now, if you'll softly stretch your limbs, mind turning your pillow into the fluffiest of parchment, because soon we'll slip into a world where work shapes not just society, but power itself. As twilight wraps its soft shawl around the worn shoulders of our shared history, let's step quietly into the still humming echo of medieval monasteries. And no, not for Gregorian chants or deep spiritual awakenings, though those did abound, but for something far more earthly, chore charts and the humble glory of productive silence. You see, monastery life wasn't just a way to avoid the bubonic plague or skip the horror of feudal taxes. It was, in many ways, the medieval equivalent of a startup incubator, but with more hay and less Wi-Fi. These sacred spaces weren't lazing around composing psalms all day, though they did their fair share. Monks worked, and boy did they work. The rule of St. Benedict, essentially the monastic employee handbook, was quite clear. Ora et labora, pray and work. Not pray or work, mind you, both, every day, like clockwork. And unlike your New Year's resolutions, the monks actually stuck to it. Dawn would crack open across stone walls, and the monastery would stir, not with alarm clocks, but with solemn bells, tolling across dew-soaked fields. The first task? Vigils, a sleepy-eyed shuffle to the chapel in solemn darkness, wrapped in contemplation and itchy wool habits. But then came the real stuff: gardening, brewing, copying manuscripts by hand. No contrepoisie for Brother Elfric. Folding endless laundry, because even holy men perspire. And of course, illuminating the occasional prayer book with gold leaf and tiny dragons as you do. Monastic work was methodical and quietly intense. Tilled soil, sacred. Brewing ale, a devotion. These monks didn't just slap together a loaf of bread and say, done. No, they charted grain cycles like they were NASA planning a satellite orbit. And their sourdough starters had more history than some noble families. Monasteries became centers of agricultural innovation too. Forgotten is the fact that they were essentially rural laboratories of trial and error successes. Want to rotate crops like a medieval genius? Thank a monk. Curious about cheese that could outlast a siege? Also a monk. They even had fish ponds regulated with a precision that would make a modern aquaculturist weep. Now let's amble further west, where the Irish monasteries buzzed with quills scratching parchment, and monks squinted under candlelight to copy entire libraries by hand. And if you've never tried to draw the Book of Kells by lamplight while hungry and pledged to silence, you haven't truly lived. There's something almost meditative in that. How these early copyists worked not for fortune or even fame. They didn't even sign the manuscripts most times, but for a kind of transcendent stability. They preserved knowledge one letter at a time, like ancient USB drives with really beautiful handwriting. And let us not forget the scriptorium, that hushed chamber of endless scribbling. On any given day, its air would be saturated with ink, quiet concentration, and probably the muffled groan of a monk accidentally smudging 12 hours of work. It was a sacred sweatshop with an art degree. But perhaps the most unexpectedly charming aspect of monastery labor was how rhythmically organized it all was. Tasks were carved into slices of time. Lauds, prime, terce, and so on. The day punctuated like a gentle spiritual metronome. Even cleaning the privy had its divine slot. Imagine scheduling your entire life with that much reverent exactitude. It's like Google Calendar, made of bells. And yet, these industrious monks weren't just working for survival or scribal legacy. They labored with the serene understanding that work itself, humble, mortal, repetitive, was a form of prayer. Something about their daily toil glowed with intention, and in that quiet glow, we find something curiously timeless. The world turned, the quills scratched, the bread rose, and so it went. So next time your sourdough fails to rise, or your desk job feels like a never-ending scriptorium of boredom, remember that somewhere in the folds of distant centuries, someone named Brother Oswald spent 6 weeks illuminating the capital G in Gloria, while swatting flies and humming under his breath. And with that, let's quiet our minds and ease the weight of centuries from our shoulders. We've admired the serene clockwork of monastic life, where every task, from beekeeping to scroll making, was cloaked in meaningful routine. Let's drift gently forward now into gentler lands, where work took another curious shape. In the gentle hush of twilight, let's close our eyes and peer one last time into the candle-lit corners of history, into the slow, deliberate rhythm of old societies, where daily work didn't just fill the hours. It shaped empires, cultures, and the art of doing nothing very energetically. Tonight, we settle into the quieter side of labor's legacy. Not the grunting of mules or sword-clashing expansion bits. No, we drift tonight into the realm of subtle influence, how the ordinary act of working steadily, repetitively, perhaps even a little begrudgingly, has gently molded the very fabric of civilization. Picture, if you will, a medieval craftsperson rising at dawn, not for glory, not even for applause, just because the sun said, "It's time." He lights a fire, rubs the sleep from his eyes with the same hands that will spend the day shaping iron, wool, or wood into something quietly magnificent. And by doing so, he does more than fill a market stall. He fills his place in the humming economic organism we now call urban society. No one called it that then, of course. They just called it life. Meanwhile, in the lush rice paddies of Song Dynasty China, a farmer whitens his brow beneath a paper hat and steps again into the warm mud. His work, both humble and heroic, feeds a city he'll never see, powers a dynasty he doesn't fully grasp, and supports a bureaucratic exam system so complex it could spin a scholar into existential despair. His days are a blend of muscle memory and weather watching. But all together, he's turning social wheels far bigger than his ox-drawn plough. Work in old times wasn't just survival. It was identity. Entire towns scented themselves accordingly. The fishy fog of a harbour, the sour warmth of breweries, the ever-present tang of soap and tallow and dye, all hanging thick over neighbourhoods named for the trades they housed. Fish Street, Leather Lane, Baker's Row. You always knew what your neighbour did for a living just by sniffing your way past his chimney. And yet, beneath it all, there was this curious thing. People worked hard, yes, but they also spent great amounts of effort not working. Consider the staggering labyrinth of religious festivals, saints' days, lunar observances, and seasonal fairs. In medieval Europe, for example, it's estimated that the average peasant might enjoy upwards of 80 rest days a year, mostly tied to church calendars, but still, that's more long weekends than most office workers today. These holidays weren't idle by accident. They were baked into the structure of belief and community. You laboured 6 days a week, give or take a plough, but feast days levelled the field, literally. Fields lay fallow as people gathered to eat prey, throw cabbages for sport, or watch a juggler risk his dignity, and possibly his life, on stilts. Work shaped life, but rest gave life texture. In many societies, the notion of work-life balance wasn't a self-help slogan but a seasonal rhythm. Agricultural calendars dictated when you broke your back and when you belly-flopped into boredom. In Scandinavian regions, the grim winter months left farmers with nothing much to do but repair equipment, weave tails, and try not to freeze. And in doing so, families bonded, communal storytelling flourished, and the oral histories that stitched together entire cultures were passed from sleepy lips to eager, sniffling ears. Even in the great churning capitals of empire, Rome, Constantinople, Edo, where bureaucracy buzzed and merchants haggled, there pulsed this simple truth. It was the drudgery of thousands that held the marble arches aloft, the dizzying glamour of emperors and generals, built partially on diligent bathhouse attendants, omelette chefs, and accountants so unthanked they practically evaporated into papyrus. There's a strange tenderness to that, isn't there? A comfort in knowing that the quiet clatter of looms, the whisper of feathers against parchment, and the echo of chisels in stone did just as much to shape history as the roar of battle. Maybe more, because while wars pause and popes pass, bread still must be baked, shoes still stitched, and someone still must clean up after the parade. So as we drift now into sleep, listen for the echoes, the faint tapping of a potter's wheel, the murmuring din of market banter, the rustle of flax turned to linen. These were the lullabies of history, ordinary sounds creating extraordinary civilizations. Close your eyes now. Rest your mind like a Roman took his siesta, deep, undisturbed, and entirely justified. For even among the mighty legions of the past, the most powerful force was simply the rhythm of a day's work well done and a good night's rest to follow.